We are recording at this point. Please proceed, Alan.
So good evening, everyone. My name is Alan Chinley. I'm co-chair of the Audubon Everglades Photography Group along with Jay Richard. We have a number of committee members with us this evening. Nancy Freeman, Charlene and Rich, Mary, and I don't think I'm missing any committee members, Julie as well. We all work together to put together everything from presentations to programs to workshops to critiques to, when applicable, to meet in person, field trips, etc. So I'm seeing a lot of new faces tonight, so welcome everyone. What I'll do is I'll hand it over to Jay. You have a few announcements to make still, I think, and then I'll take over from there.
Well, I think we have touched on those. I did.
Okay, so nothing else.
Meeting that we have, so
okay,
we'll try and stay on the time. That's one of the things that you'll see us poking each other on to try and be cognizant of everybody's time. Thank you.
Okay, so one thing, Jay, keep an eye out for people who are joining while I'm giving the presentation. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Okay, so tonight's meeting, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. As you all know tonight, the presentation is on macro photography, and it's about exploring nature through macro photography. And one of the things with macro photography, I was trying to get the poll going tonight, but unfortunately I could not, because I was looking to see how many people attending this evening are doing macro photography. But either way, it's neither here nor there. It's just another type of photography that we have access to generally with most of our lenses. You know, if you shoot with a wide angle lens, most lenses have a macro feature. The same for zoom lenses, or for those of us like myself who have a dedicated macro lens. And let's see. So macro photography, what is it? Essentially, macro photography is close-up of something small. So to give a very exaggerated example of what I mean by that, if you're photographing the porthole on a ship, even though it's a close-up of a ship, it's really not macro photography. You know, what macro photography really is referring to is photographing something close-up that, you know, say like someone's eye on their face would be considered macro photography, or if you're photographing small creatures like insects or small reptiles, or even cropping into those if you have a lens good enough to do that, that is macro photography. One of the things with macro photography, one of the big advantages of that particular type of photography is you can do it anytime, anywhere. I tend to do macro photography in my backyard. I tend to walk my neighborhood, and I'll find things growing that I can photograph just off the side of the sidewalk, or anywhere anything is growing that I have access to. One of the big pluses of macro photography is it is a very good technique to isolate or showcase a subject. I'll be giving examples of that this evening. And the other nice thing about macro photography is oftentimes, but not always, you have flexibility to move around a subject. So in other words, if you're photographing a flower, you can take it with the light behind you, you can move behind where you're backlighting the flower, you can photograph it from above if it's not a sunflower that's taller than you. If you look at the subject on the right, which I have to confess, I'm forewarning everyone, will make a guest appearance more than once more in this presentation. This is actually one of my favorite Florida subjects called a Diva Moth. And it is actually a really small moth where two of them can actually fit comfortably on your fingernail. The moth from head to the back of its wing is hardly 8 to 9 millimeters long. So it's really a small moth. One of the things, just for those of you who like to look at camera settings, on the lower right or left of every image I show tonight, I'll have my lens that I use. If it's 100 millimeter macro, it'll say 100 millimeter macro. It'll give the ISO setting, the aperture, the shutter speed, and it'll say flash if I used flash. One of the things I tried to do in this evening's presentation is the extreme majority of photographs are taken here in Florida, with a few taken outside of Florida and even less outside of the United States. So I tried to keep it the natural world as much as I could here in Florida. So moving on from that, some of the challenges with macro photography, I have heard people say, including myself, if you happen to have a dedicated macro photography lens, with a dedicated macro photography lens, oftentimes you have to get really close to your subject, and a lot of people have trouble doing that, especially when it comes to wildlife with legs or wings. The little moth in the photograph on the right, the front of my lens is literally less than 6 inches away from the subject. Needless to say, you have to be very stealthy or lucky or both to get close to a subject, especially when it's that small if you want to maximize the size of your subject in your frame. The other challenge with macro photography is, again, with a dedicated macro lens, the depth of field is razor thin, and I'll talk a little more about that in the presentation as we go along tonight. Also, manual versus autofocus. Because a millimeter can make or break a subject, meaning many of you may have heard the eye should be in focus, or the point on which you're focusing, the key point of interest in your image. If you're as close as you can be to the subject where you're experiencing razor thin depth of field, and for those of you who don't know, depth of field simply means how much is in focus in front and behind the point on which your camera focuses. When you have razor thin depth of field, just shifting by a millimeter or two can actually throw off where you meant to focus on. So I'll talk a little bit about manual versus autofocus. And many people, while I'm on focusing, many people often ask me if I use a tripod. I almost never use a tripod, and certainly not for wildlife photography. So all of the images you see tonight are handheld. The only time I typically use a tripod is when I'm doing landscape photography, and not even then, because for me, that's additional weight that I have to lug around as I'm hiking doing photography. With one of the challenges is not so much setting up your composition, but recognizing what's in the background or surrounding your subject, because in macro photography, because you're isolating a subject from an environment, all of the other elements in the frame tend to play a bigger role than, say, in a landscape image. And one of my personal challenges with macro photography is if a dragonfly, say, lands on, the tip of a grass blade and it's mildly windy out, oh my gosh, I just cannot keep the dragonfly in the frame. So wind can be a big challenge with macro photography. So some of you may be wondering, what equipment I use. And as I mentioned tonight, I have a dedicated macro lens. All my equipment is Canon, so I use a Canon 80D, and I use it in combination with a Canon 100mm 2.8 macro, and what that means is it's a relatively fast lens. And I use it in conjunction with a macro ring light. What that is, this is the circular white lens you see around the front of my lens, and that's the battery pack mounted on top of the camera. Why I use a ring light is a ring light tends to give softer shadows when it's mounted to the tip of the lens. So with macro photography, one of the reasons I use the Canon macro lens is because it's a one-to-one lens. And what that means is, Jay, if you can see who that is, and mute, please. One of the reasons I use the Canon lens is because it's a one-to-one lens, and a lot of professionals say true macro does not begin until one-to-one. And what that really means is it allows you to get really close up on subjects compared to a wide angle lens or a zoom lens with a macro feature. And you'll see some examples of that tonight. One of the challenges with any lens, regardless of whether it's macro, wide angle, or a zoom lens, is when your lens is wide open or you have a large aperture, or you step down to a very small aperture, you can encounter an anomaly called diffraction where light is bending around the aperture and it causes anomalies in the image. So if you've ever shot against the light and you see like a green outline or a blue, magenta outline around an image, that's actually taking place because of diffraction. Depending on the lens you use, if you don't have, or even if you do have a dedicated macro lens, there is equipment you can buy where you can enhance your macro feature, one of which is magnifying rings. And what magnifying rings are, they basically look like filters that screw onto the front of your lens, and they magnify the image coming into the lens, increasing your macro ability. There's also extension tubes which go between the lens and your camera, and that makes a larger image on your sensor.
Em, you out there? You guys want to watch Jeopardy? You were killing it.
Jeopardy's on.
And
Okay.
press the
If you
microphone.
haven't muted, please mute.
Sorry.
You're not unmute.
You can actually manually
right
mute
now.
them. Okay, sorry about that. So with magnifying rings, one thing to be careful about is when you use a magnifying ring on the end of your lens, what it does is it limits your focal range. And what I mean by that is you have to be a specific distance from your subject before your lens will even consider focusing on the subject. So you'll lose that, say, 3 feet to infinity that your lens has. It locks you into a much narrower range of how you can focus on the subject. So be aware of that if you're using magnifying rings. The other camera that I use, but not frequently because it does not have a dedicated macro lens, but when I'm in the field doing bird photography, oftentimes I'll encounter wildlife that's big enough where I can do macro, like dragonflies or butterflies. But what this lens does not allow me to do is if I run into a wasp that, say, is a 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch long, while I can get a half reasonable macro shot with my zoom lens, I have to do a lot of cropping before I can actually get a really good image of that wasp. So typically things that are beyond a certain size, meaning smaller than, say, 1.5 inches, I typically will not use my zoom lens to do that unless it's specifically to say I saw something, so it becomes really documenting that I've seen something. So with that said, macro photography, I have a lot of fun with it. I'm sure a lot of us here on this evening have a lot of fun with it. I was in Palm Beach County at a detention pond a while ago, and this detention pond, an area that sort of captures stormwater temporarily, had a lot of false water hemlock, which are these small white flowers around. There was water that you cannot see in the image. There's a black swallowtail flying at the very center of this image. So right away, I knew this was a goldmine of macro opportunities, everything from photographing the flowers to the butterfly. I mean, some of the things you're not seeing in this image are dragonflies, spiders, insects that were walking on the water. I mean, it really was a treasure trove of small things that macro photography can take advantage of. For tonight, some of the best things that I will showcase from this area is on the false water hemlock, which is one of the host lands for the black swallowtail. This egg, the little brown thing you see at the top center of the image being displayed, has a black swallowtail egg, and the black on the egg is actually the head capsule of the caterpillar that's developing. This picture, while it wasn't taken here because the caterpillar pictures that I took here weren't as nice as this one, so I decided to showcase this one. This is the caterpillar that this egg hatches out into, and these caterpillars were all over this detention pond. I was unwilling to get on my elbows and knees to photograph them because, like I said, it was very wet, and I did not have anything to clean myself off to get back into my car. So I walked away with not very many pictures of caterpillars from this trip. However, I did get this one image, and this is a very close-up image of the head and thoracic area of the caterpillar looking right at me, or you know, it's really not looking at me, but it was aware of my presence. With one hand, I was actually holding the stem it was on. So the caterpillar actually stood up in defensive mode, which gave me an opportunity to take this picture. And this actually is one of the great things about having a dedicated macro lens, is you can get really close up on small subjects, and you don't have to do a lot of cropping except for composition. And it really showcases the subject, especially with a lot of the detail that it has. You can see that I was shooting. You can see the information, my camera settings at the bottom of each image, as I mentioned. F13, I find with my macro lens, is about the smallest aperture I can get before I begin to get diffraction. And with my lens, what diffraction does is my images get less and less sharp, not terribly so, but enough so that I notice. So I tend to not stray very far or much smaller than an aperture of f13, because I like my images to be as sharp as they can be. This, of course, is the black swallowtail that the caterpillar and the egg turns into ultimately. So I was talking about one of the challenges with macro photography being autofocus versus manual focus. I had mentioned earlier that if you use autofocus, I encourage you to use single point autofocus, where you tell your camera which point in your frame you want to put on the subject, to tell the camera exactly where to focus. In my case, I was actually photographing. I don't know if you can see my cursor moving, but I was photographing. I was aiming to focus right at the base of the abdomen, just above the thorax. And between me rocking back and forth a millimeter or two and the wind gently moving the dragonfly, I typically will take 4, 5, or 6 shots, hoping to nail at least one of the shots. When you look at this next shot, you can see the camera did a much better job, where it did focus, in fact, on the plane of the subject where I wanted it to. You can see, compared to the previous image, not just is the abdomen in focus or the body of the dragonfly, the head is mostly in focus and most of the wings are in focus. If you're lucky enough to have a subject that's not moving, meaning a flower or otherwise, you can use autofocus with a single point, or you can set up a tripod and use manual focus. You have to figure out what works best for you. I tend to rely on single point autofocus, and I take a number of pictures to make sure I nail at least one of the pictures where I want the focal point to be. Depth of field, as I mentioned, with macro photography, depth of field is razor thin. And this is one example of showing how thin the depth of field can be. You can see in this image, I'm using a very large aperture of f4.5. And one of the tricks when you're photographing something flat is to try and get the subject as parallel to your sensor as you possibly can. So I don't know how clearly you can see this on your monitor, but the extreme majority of the butterfly is in sharp focus, with the exception of the tail, which is just about falling out of focus. One of the reasons I used an aperture of f4.5 is that blurred background that you're seeing was about 6 to 8 inches behind the subject. And I wanted to blur the background to isolate the subject from the busyness of the background as much as possible. So that's one of the advantages of macro photography, is in some cases, you can still manage with a large aperture to really isolate your subject and really, no pun intended, get the focus of your subject without the busyness of the background. This image was taken with my 100 to 400 millimeter zoom lens. I was up in Jensen Beach, and in Jensen Beach, this ground orchid was all over the STA that's just wet on the west side of the Savannah Preserve State Park. So I got down on the ground to make the vertical spike of the orchid, and from the base of the lowest bloom that you see at the bottom to the very tip of the spike is maybe about 5 inches. So what I did was I got down on the ground to try and get the vertical spike, the flower blossom, parallel to my sensor. and using f8, which I have found for my zoom lens to be the largest aperture that I want to use where I get good sharpness or reasonably good depth of field. One of the big advantages of macro photography, once again, is you can absolutely isolate your subject from the background, especially if the background is further away from the subject. You can get these nice blurry variations of color that really showcase your subject. Walking around this field, there were literally dozens upon dozens of these orchid blooms. I wanted to do another type of image where I started to pull patterns and the impression of another bloom spike in the background. So I looked for one that had another bloom spike in the background. You can see I increased my depth of field from f8 to f9. And in this instance, some of the grass blades were a little closer. So you get that nice patterning or nice visual movement that can enhance an image. So it's not always about absolute isolation. It's how you want to frame your image with that's around the subject that you're photographing. And another example of including more of the subject, meaning bringing it more into focus, is as I walked around, I actually found where these two bloom spikes were directly adjacent to each other. You see that I've moved from f9 to f11, and I actually pulled in more of the background. So what I'm doing is I'm adding a little more of the environment step by step, depending on where the subject is and what aperture I'm using to either blur out or bring slightly more into focus what's going on around the subject. This is another example of showcasing isolation of a subject with macro photography. I am using the largest possible aperture on my 100mm macro lens of f2.8. This here, again, I'm making the subject as parallel to my sensor as it can be. And fortunately, the butterfly cooperated very nicely, where it opened its wings very flat. And that gave me an opportunity to snap this picture. By contrast, this next picture is going to f14. This is exactly the same situation. The reason the background has gone dark is because I'm using f14. So it's darkening everything around it as I maintain my exposure for the subject, which is the butterfly. But you can see how many more of the palm frond flower spikes come into focus. I'll go back for a second so you see how big of a difference depth of field can make. And that's one of the advantages of macro photography, is you can really blur the background in many cases to give nice showcasing or highlighting of the subject onto itself without the busyness of what's going on around it. Lighting is plays an important role in macro photography. One thing I'll say is with macro photography with regards to lighting, for those of us who do a lot of landscape photography or bird photography, you'll hear a lot of photographers saying, shoot early in the morning, shoot later in the afternoon, don't shoot at high noon. With macro photography, you can really shoot anytime, day or night, literally. And as many of you saw at the beginning of the presentation, I have a ring light flash on my camera. So even if I'm shooting at high noon, I can actually mitigate the shadowing that's going on the subject. And I'll show an example of that in a while. When the flash is mounted at the end of my lens, when the ring light flash I'm referring to that you saw in the second slide of the presentation, the light is actually parallel to the lens. And one of the effects that has is it softens or eliminates shadows. You can see here around these butterfly eggs, there's minimal or soft shadowing around the subject. But what that tends to do as well, and it may not be desirable, is when the ring light flash is mounted on the end of my lens and the light is parallel, it tends to flatten an image. So by taking the flash off of the lens and holding it at an angle, I actually create directional light that creates dimension in the subject. So that's one thing to be very aware of if you happen to have a macro flash, meaning it can either be a ring light or it can have two flashes that mount to the left and right of your lens. Be aware one of the functions when it's mounted to the lens is you can inadvertently take away the dimension of your image and create a flattish looking image. Lighting. This buck moth was taken here at Blazing Star Natural Area here in Boca Raton. And this buck moth was perched on the stem of a vine in the shade. So I was actually using flash to photograph the subject. As I was photographing the subject in the shade, the sun kept coming and going from behind clouds. It was a spotty, cloudy day. And one really nice thing happened. A few minutes into photographing this individual, the sun came out and lit only the background. So I still had to use flash to get a good exposure on the buck moth, but you can see with the background sunlit now, you can actually see the detail of the antennae really well. If I had not used flash to light the subject in this image, the second image on the right, and I had to expose for the moth, the background would have been very blown out. It would have been practically white. So that's one of the nice things about using, in this case, what I like to call fill flash. And again, I'll show some other examples of this. This here was taken up at Sweet Gum Natural Area, which is by the small airport off of Beeline Highway. This is the caterpillar of an Io moth. And for those of you who don't know caterpillars of butterflies and moths, I will warn you, if you see something that looks spiny, assume it's not friendly. The Io moth, if you brush into it, for those of us who are avid gardeners who may have had this unfortunate experience, I've heard people say it's akin to feeling like someone pressed a lit cigarette against you. So be very aware. It is as treacherous. It's not poisonous, but it will give you a very good sting. I think it's a very beautiful looking caterpillar. When you look at this image, you can see the top half of the leaf is in shade. You can see below the vein in front, the head of the caterpillar, which is on the lower right side. You can see it's deeply in shade, but it's not overly contrasty, which is a good thing. But what I did to showcase is the second picture, I did use a little bit of flash, and I can vary the power on my flash. I used a little bit of flash just to reduce the shadowing in the previous image. So it gives a nicer, softer image. And then in this third image, I actually made the flash more powerful, and I've actually removed almost all of the shadowing that's on the leaf. So this is what I mean by fill flash, is you can use flash to sort of reduce the severity of the shadowing going on in an image. And oftentimes that can help to give a nicer image, a softer looking image that doesn't have these hard contrasting lit and shadowed areas in an image. This here is an example of doing photography at night. I was at a friend's house in Lake Worth, and in his backyard, walking around with a flashlight, this male pond hawk dragonfly was sleeping under a leaf, well, up until I hit it with the flashlight. And I snapped off a few images with flash. So this was taken, I think, at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock at night. And it's not unusual for me to walk around my backyard with a flashlight. I'll find everything from sleeping Cuban night anoles to sleeping iguanas to brown anoles, dragonflies, zebra longwing butterflies. There are a number of things I'll find in my yard that I can photograph at night. And the one thing I do is I shine an LED light on the subject so that my camera can focus, because my flash actually will override the light from the flash, so I won't get any sort of fake looking lighting, meaning the color of the light from the flashlight that I'm using to assist my camera with focusing. So one of the things we talked about with macro is getting up close, and these next few images will actually showcase how close you can get up to something if you're using a macro lens, especially if the macro lens has one-to-one capability. And what one-to-one capability means is, let's assume you have a camera with a full-size sensor. When you are at the closest point at which your macro lens will focus, a subject that is a ½ an inch wide in reality will be a ½ an inch wide on your sensor. If you're using an APC or APS sensor, you'll get the zoom factor, so you'll actually get greater than life, you'll get that small magnification. But that's one of the big advantages with having a macro lens that's 1-to-1, is you can get really close up to subjects. This was taken up at Bok Tower. This is a tiger beetle, and the tiger beetle is maybe 3/4 of an inch long, so we're talking really small. But because I'm using a dedicated macro lens, I can actually swing around in front the subject. Of course, at this point, I'm not even 6 inches away from the subject, so I'm approaching it very, very slowly. This actually shows you that I can even get in closer to the image. Of course, looking at it from above, the image is, the subject is larger, so I can be a little further away and not have to get as close. So that's one of the nice advantages of macro photography, is if a subject will let you, you can get quite close to it and get very good detail, filling the frame mostly, depending on how small the subject is. This here was taken at Butterfly World. This is a relative of the zebra longwing. It's about the same size of a zebra longwing. You can see with the dedicated macro lens how I came right up and I could crop into the butterfly really closely. You can almost see the scale patterns on the wing of the butterfly. You can see the modified scales that look like hairs on the body, and you can see all of the pollen that this butterfly has gathered during its feeding during the day, that it has coiled around its proboscis, which it does digest as the day goes on, just so you know. This here is a mangrove skipper caterpillar. It probably is about an inch, just about an inch, maybe an inch and a quarter long. The mangrove skipper lays its eggs on red mangroves. So red mangroves, if you're in and around any area that has red mangroves, you know, you have a very good chance of finding mangrove skipper caterpillars. And typically what they'll do is they'll bind the leaves together. So if you sort of hold it with your finger just slightly, you'll sometimes be able to peep into and see the caterpillar in between the leaves. But being macro photography, I can actually get really close up on the head, and you can see the texturing in the head capsule of this species head. I mean, and that's one thing I really enjoy with macro photography, is really coming up close. You can make things look alien or out of this world. You can just give it a completely different sense of dimension where people don't know how big or small the subject really is. It just looks freaky or otherworldly, which is one of the nice things about doing photography really close up with a, you know, macro style. For those of you unfamiliar with the mangrove skipper, this is the adult. I'll get into know your subject or understanding your subject in a little while. For those of us familiar with mangrove skippers, you may go, when I've seen them in the wild, they hardly have this much blue on them. And you're right, they typically don't have this much blue, but because my macro lens, I always walk around with the flash on it, I know the mangrove skipper has a lot of iridescent scales on the top side of the wings. So even in sunlight, I'll use very weak flash, and the flash typically will bring up iridescence in many butterflies or anything that has iridescence. You just have to know if flash is complementing it by bringing it up, or if it's causing the image to look a little too contrasty. So again, that's about knowing your subject and how it photographs with flash. One of the great other benefits of macro photography is you really get to see patterns and textures of your subjects. I was down at Fairchild Botanical Garden, and this large male iguana was walking up a diagonal, the trunk of a palm tree that was diagonal. And some of you may be asking, well, how is the background so black? What was really fortunate in this situation, you'll see I did not use flash if you're looking at the camera settings, is because I was exposing for the light grays on the head of the iguana. The background was actually in the shade. There was a hammock behind the palm tree that was completely in shade. So just by virtue of exposing for the light coloration on the iguana, the dark background actually became black. And that's another technique for isolating an image beyond macro photography. In Phoenix, Arizona, at the Desert Botanical Gardens, I was fascinated with this cactus looking directly down on it. And I stood up above it, and using a relatively moderate aperture of f8, I did not want to go much past f8 because if I'd gone to f13, which is another one of the apertures in macro I love to use, what's going on behind the subject area would have come a little too much into focus and the image would have been a little too busy. So I really wanted to showcase the top growing area of this particular cactus that I encountered. The Diva Moth that was in the second frame where I said, beware, it's going to show up again. Well, here is the cocoon of the Diva Moth, and it's on ficus. If you can see my cursor on the right side of the diamond shape within the white cocoon, you can barely see the caterpillar. You can see the venation here on the ficus leaf, but because I wanted to showcase, I do a lot of documenting type photography as well, because I wanted to showcase the silhouette of the caterpillar. I actually held my flash behind the leaf, and not only did I get the silhouette of the caterpillar, but you can see how the pattern of the leaf really comes up in this case. So patterns are one of the great things you can showcase in macro photography. This was a side benefit in addition to silhouetting the subject that I wanted to showcase inside the cocoon on the leaf. I got home one evening, so this is shot here in Boca Raton, to see this Halloween pennant dragonfly perched on the unopened bract of one of my heliconias. It was backlit. This was at about 5:30. It was just outside my kitchen window. It was too far away for me to reach with my macro lens. So I pulled out my 100 to 400 millimeter zoom lens, and I used an aperture of f10, and I was actually exposing to really highlight. You can see the pattern in a great way because of the backlighting. And that's my fence in the background that's in shade. So because I was actually exposing for the light coloration on the wings, my fence, which was in shade, actually created a nice dark background, which really showcases the pattern on this Halloween pennant dragonfly. And that really is one of my favorite things with macro, is how it brings details or patterns to light. Exploring angles, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, is one of the big advantages of macro photography. So if you're on a safari in Africa and you see a lion, you really don't have a chance to tell the lion, hey, hold that pose, the lighting is coming from the wrong angle, let me move around and get to your better side. You know, you have to take the picture from the angle that you're at, if you choose to take a picture at all, if the lighting's not right. With macro photography, oftentimes you have more options. So these two little Serranus blue butterflies I had photographed when I was down in Key West, I was walking down, I forget which street it was. It wasn't Duval, but just off on the side of the street on one of the grasses that were growing in the cracks, these two little Serranus blue butterflies were copulating. And for those of you who don't know, these butterflies are barely the size of your little fingernail. So I'm really close up, I'm down on my elbows, you know, looking like a crazy person trying to get eye level with the subject. The sun was to my back, and I did like this photograph, but because I love backlighting, I moved around to the other side of the subject and I got what I consider to be a much more dramatic picture with the edge of the butterfly coming into highlight. You can see the hairs on the underside of the butterflies really highlighted, the grass seed spikes highlighted, as well as the fringe on the lower butterfly really being highlighted. The picture on the left I really like also, but compared to the one on the right has more dramatic impact in my opinion. This Io moth I photographed last week in my backyard. It was actually about 6:30 in the evening. It was overcast and it was drizzling. You'll note that the bark of the strong bark is actually wet. And it was drizzling. I didn't care. I know my camera can take a little bit of moisture without getting any short circuiting. So this is unfortunately based on experience. So I went out there and I photographed this moth, I think for a good 15-20 minutes before the rain started to come down a little too hard. And that's again, like I said, I do macro photography anytime, anywhere, rain or sun. I've even been known to go out in a light to moderate rain with an umbrella and do photography to get subjects that have had raindrops on them. Being macro photography coming in on the hind wing of that same individual you saw in the previous picture, you can actually see this almost tapestry-like pattern that's on the hind wing of the moth. On the upper right-hand side, that's the hairy body of the moth. The lower right-hand side is the hind wing with the eye spot. This picture really showcases the scaling on the wings of this particular type of moth here in Florida. And while this is a different individual, this is a male, the other one you just saw was a female, I swung around to look and photograph the antennae head on in this picture. One thing with this picture, why I will never enter this picture in a photography competition or anything, unfortunately, one of the leaves of the palm that the IO moth was on is just behind, the right antenna goes just behind one of the palm leaves, and I can hear a judge saying both antennae should be clearly in the picture, and I would not disagree. But for demonstrative purposes tonight, this shows how you can move up close to a subject you're already close to. You can crop in on detail, you can take a different angle on the subject, and you can get a range of different pictures with different moods based on just moving around the same subject. This is another example of moving around a subject. This was taken up at Hungryland Wildlife Management Area in Jupiter. And this grasshopper was busily eating away at this celestial lily. And you can see the background. I used an f-stop of F9 because some of the grass blades were reasonably close to the background. I used flash because this was at about 6:30 in the evening. So you can see how the grass blades in the background give a nice diagonal pattern, giving a little bit of visual movement in contrast to the vertical stem and the vertical positioning of the grasshopper. But I was not satisfied with this shot, so I moved in on this angle. And this to me is a more dramatic shot, whereas the other shot is more documentary-like. And again, that's what I love about macro, is you can photograph it from all different angles. In the second shot, the background, anything that was in the background was much further away. And because I was using flash to light the subject, the background automatically became exponentially darker. So that's one of the advantages of using flash on an already lowering light or darkening evening. This was taken in Scotland of a Himalayan blue poppy. This flower is about the size of a hibiscus, a medium-sized hibiscus, and as brilliantly blue as the flower is, and this is the natural color. I was fascinated by the detail on the inside of the flower, and because my mind thinks in terms of macro, I typically instantly look for detail and I come in on it. And again, moving around a subject, I took different angles of a different flower. And then once again, I found a flower that was more open, that was backlit. And that gives, I'll consider the first two images that I showed similar, with this one being very different, by just moving around and looking at the various lighting and how it affects the different subjects. And that to me, on a singular subject, you can actually get numerous different types of images that are very meaningful and impactful depending on your style. And understanding your subject oftentimes is one of the keys to macro photography, especially if you're dealing with things that can run away or fly away from you. I'll start with the celestial lily that appeared in previously. This is a state threatened flower that exists in wetlands. This again was taken at Hungryland Wildlife Management Area. It had rained earlier, so there were nice water drops on the flower. It was early afternoon, but the flower was in the shade. In order to have a chance of photographing this flower, these flowers open for a limited time only. And when I say that, it's worse than a paid commercial at night. It truly is for a limited time only, because the flowers open at about 3 to 4:30 in the afternoon. And by 5:30 to 6:30, they're closing already. So they're open fully for maybe 2.5, 3 hours tops. So you can get different situations when you understand a subject, when you know where and how to find it and what situation you'd like to find it in. For those who've wanted to photograph dagger wings as adults, the males like to nectar on flowers that have paralozidine alkaloids. That's a big fancy word. This butterfly here, this individual here, is on a native plant called bloodberry. And these flowers have paralosidine alkaloids. And what that is, it's a chemical that the males use to enhance its toxicity to predators, but also to court females. So if I'm in an area that has these flowers that have paralosidine alkaloids, and I see strangler figs around, which is one of its host plants, I know that there's a reasonable chance I may find this butterfly. And if I see this butterfly flying around a ficus tree, and I see it curving its abdomen, because I know that ficus is its host plant, you can see this magenta egg here. That is the egg of a daggerwing butterfly. And that is using my 100mm macro lens with a 2x magnification ring with a 4x magnification ring stacked on it to give me a total of 6x magnification on top of my macro lens to give me that nice detail in this egg. One of the nice things if you encounter daggerwings, its caterpillar is one of the most spectacular caterpillars, in my opinion, here in Florida. This was taken on the boardwalk at Tradewinds Park in Coconut Creek. So it's a really spectacular caterpillar. So knowing your subject really can optimize your chances of finding certain subjects in the wild, especially if you're targeting things in particular. So if you're targeting things in particular, what I do is I encourage you to do a little bit of research. It oftentimes can make a big difference on whether you do find the subject or not, and if you're able to get a good shot of the subject or not. Dragonflies, many of us have noticed that oftentimes dragonflies, the Halloween pennant in particular, if you approach it very slowly and it flies off, there's a very good chance it's going to come back to the same perch. This dragonfly is actually perched on a twig. It's actually not flying. That is native cord grass in the background. And because I'm using a large aperture of f5.6, I did not want the background to be too busy. As you can see, the grass blades are all very parallel and numerous in the background. So I really wanted to isolate the subject. So again, I literally needed to approach the subject very cautiously and get directly above the subject, again, making the wings parallel to my sensor so that with an aperture of 5.6 to optimize the blurring of the background behind the wings. That's why oftentimes I will select a very large aperture. It means something is in the background that if I use a smaller aperture will become too prominent in the background and make for a very busy image. This orchid bee was at Gumbo Limbo Nature Center. While they're nectaring, oftentimes, this one was nectaring on pentas. They also nectar on firebush. You'll find them on orchids oftentimes. But if you manage to approach them closely, oftentimes what they'll do is once they finish feeding, they'll fly up, they'll hover for a little while, they look at the pesky photographer, and that gives you a few fleeting seconds on which you can photograph it with, while it's in flight. This individual was actually backlit. The sun was to my face, the sun was to his back, and I actually used flash as fill flash to light the front end of the orchid bee. This is a yellowneck caterpillar, again at Hungryland Wildlife Management Area. They feed on Lyonia, which is off to the left and right of most or many areas of the path. These caterpillars I know to be gregarious, meaning they grow up in groups. And I love this subject, yellow and black lateral striping, red legs, red head capsule, white hairs. I like contrasting it against a darker background. But because I know they're gregarious and I wanted to get a situation of a group of them, in about 1 week, I went back about 3 times. And on the 3rd day, I lucked out where I got 6 individuals that were freshly molted. And the reason I know they're freshly molted is you can see the discarded skins that they molt. Remember, they have exoskeletons. So in order to grow, they actually molt their previous skin. And these are freshly molted because they haven't even cast off the old caterpillar skin yet. And they're all clustered at the tip of this. And I've only found this once, but chances are when they're back in season, I think I'll make another trip to see what other types of situations I can get the caterpillars in. Composition, yes.
You have about 7 minutes till 8.
Yeah.
A time check.
Yep, I'll be wrapping up. This is the last section here. Thanks, Jake. So composition, as I mentioned, in macro photography, this here is a prickly pear cactus, Florida, native plant to Florida. You can see I'm shooting at an f-stop of f8. If I'd used anything more than f8, the background behind actually would have started coming into focus a little more, making things very busy. Even though you'll hear people saying never center your image, rules are made to be broken. You don't always have to use rule of thirds, but you do need to be aware in macro photography, be very aware of what's going on in your background, because oftentimes if your background is too busy, it can outcompete or compete with your image more so, especially if you're entering your images competitively. You want to be very aware of how your background complements your image. On the same plant, I use the advantage of being able to get close to a subject. So I was using my flash to highlight the side of the petals, which inadvertently, by artificially lighting the flower, I was able to use a very small aperture of f13, which automatically blacked out the background behind. So I was able, with artificial lighting, to highlight the edges of the petals in addition to the spines on the cactus and black out the background to really showcase the image. This fly here is a Technic Fly. It's a parasitic fly that lays its eggs in butterfly caterpillars or butterfly chrysalids. It is about the same size as a housefly if you're unfortunate enough to have houseflies. And this image here is using rule of thirds. I'm using a very shallow, I'm using a reasonably large-ish aperture of f6.3 to blur out the rest of the plant that was reasonably close behind the subject. And because the fly, the flower, and the buds below it are reasonably parallel to my sensor, that's how I'm able to get most of what I want in focus, that it's not too much of the image falling out of focus. This here was taken with my iPhone 4S, so that tells you this picture is very old. One of the things when you're using a wide angle lens or a compact camera with a built-in lens, meaning you don't have the ability to change lenses, if it's a wide angle lens, oftentimes you can see the aperture here is f2.4, which is a very large aperture, yet you can very clearly see the mangrove behind the subject, so it makes for a very busy image. Not an image for competition, but again, the purpose of your image, if this is for educational purposes, for a field guide, for a documentary type story, this image tells a great story. This dragonfly in the same species of banana spider web was taken at the Lantana Natural Area last weekend, in fact. And with what I did was I used an f-stop of f7.1. That way, because I was looking up into the canopy of trees with backlighting, I was very aware that they come down to these spots of light in the background, which can be very busy. This next image, with a little patience, the spider came down for the dragonfly, but you can see all the points of light coming through the mangrove here at Lantana Preserve. And in my opinion, it's bordering on busy. But again, it depends on what the purpose of your image is. What are you using it for? Is it an art picture? Is it for publication in a wildlife publication? You know, what is your image being used for that dictates the type of image you can make and what you can tolerate that's in the background or otherwise. This hermit crab was strolling across under sea grapes. I forget the name of the area, but it was south of the Lantana Preserve, where you park on the west side of A1A, you cross A1A to go through this little preserve onto the beach. So this hermit crab was strutting around on the discarded sea grape leaves. And I actually took advantage because I was really liking its red legs and the pattern on its shell. And this was one of the best pictures I got. This guy must have had a cappuccino late in the afternoon because he just wouldn't stop for anything. And back to this moth again. When I was photographing this moth, it actually flew off the flower, and I just raised my hand in its path and it landed on my hand and it began to drink my sweat. And I got a picture that I'd always wanted to get to showcase how this moth is, how small this moth is. You can see the size of the moth relative to my thumbnail. And like I said, this moth is 8 millimeters long, less than a centimeter long. This is the picture I was taking. Some people may be thinking, oh my gosh, what do I look at, the moth or the beautiful center of the flower? And you'd be right. And again, it comes down to not an image necessarily for competition, because a judge will undoubtedly tell you two things are competing. But again, it comes down to what is the purpose of your image? So because this picture, one could argue, had two competing elements that were of great interest, I took this picture to showcase the moth itself. And just to show you, if you look at the wings of the moth are so small that you can actually see the scales looking extremely large relative to its wings. And that tells you how small this moth is. And with that said, I'll take any questions that any of you may have this evening.
Well, let me jump in and I'll highlight some of the questions I see over here, Al.
Sure.
One comment I'll make, remember, if you're taking photos, the first thing is you have to like the photo. So when we talk about competition or how you might use it, a lot of my photos I just use for my own pleasure or, you know, some selected friends. So with that said, you've got an awful lot of people that really admired the work you put out here. Here's one comment. You're an excellent presenter, stunning images, thoroughly enjoyable, informative, and easy to understand due to clarity and your explanations. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
That seems to summarize a lot of the comments. One other thing I didn't mention at the beginning is if you haven't registered with the photo club, please do, because you know, you'll be involved in a lot of their activities like critique sessions. If you look on the website, there's an easy way to register. You know, if you have any questions, please get a hold of us and we'll have Mary talk to you if we can answer the question, because she's the interface and we really want to make her earn her keep too. I can't see her, so obviously I'm throwing a stone where I can't see. It broke the glass.
Michael, you have a question?
Yes, I do. I have a 60 millimeter macro lens. And if I put an extension tube on the camera, will I be able to get further back?
It depends. I have a 50 millimeter macro lens by Canon, and it's a 2-to-1 lens, meaning it's half life size. So if I'm photographing a subject that's an inch big, it'll be a half an inch on my sensor at closest range. But I have for that lens what's called a life size converter. And what it basically does is it makes it a 1-to-1 lens. You'll have to do some research on your lens to see what an extension tube will do. With the life size converter on my 50 millimeter lens, I can use my lens and I can focus to infinity to close to me. You'll have to do research to see if an extension tube on your lens allows you that latitude, or if it will cut your focal range down to, say, 12 inches to 3 feet. Look into it to see what it does and what its magnification is, but most importantly, if it limits your ability to focus within or beyond a certain point. That's one of the key things you want to pay attention to, because what you do sometimes, if an extension tube in fact does cut down on your focal range ability, that limits you in the field. You automatically have to know your range, and anything outside that range, you'll automatically know you have no chance of getting an image on. My magnifying rings do that. I do not think extension tubes do that, but definitely do a little research. Jay can always put the phone number of Hunts. They can answer questions like that for our members. And whereas I'm not the expert on equipment, whereas Hunts can guide you on things like that.
Yeah, Hunts is one of the
Thank you.
supporters, and you'll see them come up in some of the future programs and workshops. But one of the questions came up was, how can I view this recording? And that's been a challenge for us up until this point. Alan, do you want to comment where you think we're at now?
Sorry, Jay, I was reading a question. Say that again.
Would you like to comment where you think we are with being able to provide program?
Oh, okay. I know we've been saying for a while that we'll be posting presentations, but I have been in talks with Audubon Everglades, and it appears we are very close to being able to post the images. So Mary being our formal interface, what we will do is when we get the video of all of our historic last season's presentations, in addition to this evening's presentation, we will send out a blast email, we will send out notification on Facebook, and that we will let people know where on our website you'll be able to source the recordings of the previous presentations, including tonight's presentation. There's a question that came up from Jan. It sort of went away, so let's see.
Well, there's one question out there. How do I register for October 4th? There'll be an announcement come out. In that announcement, from in Constant Contact, you'll see the registration.
Okay, Jan is asking, may I ask why you use such a low ISO? The reason I use such a low ISO, if you were paying attention to my ISOs, you'll see I typically shoot between ISO 100, and for me going to ISO 400 is living on the edge. Jay will laugh at me because he shoots at ISO 3200 and 6400, but for me ISO 400 is living dangerously. And one of the reasons I use such low ISOs is because oftentimes I'm using supplemental lighting, my flash. So when my backgrounds are lit by sunlight and I'm using flash to either reduce the shadowing and get better depth of field on a subject, because it allows me to use a smaller aperture, which increases my depth of field, the flash actually helps me to use a lower ISO. And for any of you that are wondering, you know, a lot of my sharpness in my images comes because of flash. And by that, what I mean is flash has a strobe or freezing effect. So even if my subject is blowing very slightly in the wind and my flash is overriding the natural light, meaning not supplementing to fill in the shaded areas, but actually the flash being set brighter to the light that's naturally on the subject, it will have a freezing effect, and in essence, like a strobe, it'll freeze the frame for the camera.
One thing, and we mentioned that Alan and I joust with each other a bit. The one thing I go back and say, as I mentioned earlier, get to know your equipment, your camera. Take a lot of pictures and get rid of a lot of pictures till you find what works for you in various situations. I shoot with two cameras too, and they're quite different. So lots of times I will be changing how I shoot, even for similar subjects.
All
Other
right.
questions, comments?
Beautiful images, Alan, thank you. Quick question. This one came and went so quickly. Yeah, it'll come back.
That's okay. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question if you have one, while Joshua remembers his question. Hopefully I'll remember the answer. But yes, macro photography is a lot of fun. It really, I mean, you can go out in your backyard, you can walk your neighborhood. And one thing that's very important with macro photography is oftentimes it's good to do research if you have a particular subject in mind. That way you can see how other people have photographed it. It can help you to visualize what you're going to do. Because I've been doing macro photography for almost 20 years, I see a subject and I already have it in my mind what I want to be on my sensor that I want to see when I get home in post-processing. So it's not that I go out and see a subject and make the best of it, which does happen, like the hermit crab. But oftentimes I've been in situations, having done macro photography for so long, that I know how I want to photograph it. I know how I want to frame it in the camera. I tend to back off a little bit from my subject now. I was old school film, fill the frame. And with digital photography now, I like to leave myself a little room for cropping and rotating a little bit to give myself that little extra latitude. Michael?
Yeah, you have mentioned many times about having your subject parallel to your image sensor. How do you know what position whether your sensor is flat against the lens or it's tilted back or?
Here's the best way I can describe that. So if this is your butterfly at an angle, you know the sensor in your camera is parallel with the front and back of your camera. So basically what you want to do is you want to get the face of your camera as parallel as you can or flat as you can to the subject. So what I do when I'm doing close-up photography on a subject like the giant swallowtail that has a flat surface, I'll take a picture and then I'll inch up a bit, take a picture, lean right a bit, take a picture, lean left a bit. So I sort of just incrementally adjust my position. And you guys who know me in the club, it's not unusual for me to take 20, 30, 40, 50 pictures of a subject if it will allow me to, because I'm looking for that one shot where everything is as I'm hoping it will be. And because the depth of field is so shallow, that's why I do micro adjustments all around the subject. So it's not that I intuitively know, I can guesstimate and then I adjust from there. And hopefully I luck out on one of the images.
I remembered my question, sorry.
Sure.
So do you post in Lightroom and Photoshop, or you just use Photoshop?
I have yet to use Lightroom. I own Lightroom and I've only ever accidentally opened it. And all my post-processing is done in Photoshop.
Okay, thanks.
But any post-processing software works. Because I use Photoshop doesn't change the quality of my images. So the only difference, in my opinion, that post-processing software does is if you're using freeware, you only have this many functions available to you. If you're using paid software, you open yourself up to a world more. In the case of Photoshop, I think I use maybe 2%, and that's being generous, of the capabilities of Photoshop. But because I grew up with Photoshop since version 1.0, I'm willing to use Photoshop. And in my opinion, Photoshop on a personal subscription of $10 a month, a personal account, to always have the most up-to-date version, $10 a month for the kind of photography and the amount of photography I do, even though I'm not generating revenue with my photography, it's worth it, you know, to always have the most up-to-date version of my software. So it's not software specific per se, it's how well you know your personal, the software you choose to use, and if it does what you're looking to do.
You know, your images look like they're untouched, you know, it looks like you don't use much post at all.
Yeah, I try, that's a very good comment. I tend to be a purist. I try to do everything in camera. I do color correcting, dust removal, sharpening and cropping. I'll do nominal saturation to recreate what I think I saw. And keep in mind, that's what I mean, what I think I saw, because, you know, we see a sunset and we think it's so brilliant, but is it as brilliant as we make it on our computer? Well, oftentimes it's not as brilliantly orange or gold as we make it. So the question is, you know, trying to duplicate reality in a realistic way is what I try to do. Because if someone looks at one of my images and goes, ah, man, that's too colorful, you know, I feel like I've misrepresented the subject if in fact I did saturate the color on the subject. And then I'll reevaluate and go, they've not seen the actual subject, so they really don't know. That actually did happen once. Someone did tell me the subject was too colorful. I saturated the subject and I said, you really need to see the subject for yourself. You actually will see that the image is very close to representing the actual colors on the subject. And the person kind of brushed me off. So, yeah, you know.
Didn't know.
The eye of the beholder.
Exactly.
Alan, Alan, I have a question. So a lot of times I find that when I'm shooting macro with just my camera and my 60mm macro lens, I'm blowing out either part or all of the subject on sunny days, particularly when it's like a white or yellow or an iridescent. I'm finding I'm blowing out either part or all of the subject. Is there anything that you recommend to?
Okay, that really is a great problem that many people encounter. Typically, if you're photographing a contrast subject, meaning if the subject has white and black in it, or white and a medium to dark color, you should be exposing for the highlight. You should be exposing for the brightest part of the image and bringing everything up in post-processing. If you're shooting an image that has a very bright or highlighted area and a lot of darks in it, and you know in post-processing you're gonna have to bring up the details in post-processing, you wanna shoot with a lower ISO. So I would recommend ISO 400 in my experience. You have to see what works for you and lower. Because what happens is as you bring up the lighting in an area, you start to get a lot of artificial noise. You can start to get banding. And the higher the ISO, the closer to proper exposure your subject should be, so you can successfully do it in post-processing. That's for the white areas. When you're shooting things that are inherently reflective or shiny, so the wings of a dragonfly can be reflective, the iridescence on a butterfly can be shiny and reflective both at the same time. The unfortunate thing is you almost have to change your angle to cut down on that reflection. So it comes to the angle you take to photograph your subject to try and reduce or mitigate the reflective properties of the subject. So like with the dragonfly that was caught in the spider's web, because I was using flash, I was holding the flash above me, to the left, to the right, in front. You know, I was moving it all over the place to land on a shot where the reflection, the reflective membranes on the wing wouldn't just kind of scream back at me with all white. So expose for the white, and when it comes to reflective surfaces, try to adjust your angle. The angle you end up with is not necessarily the angle you want, but in this case, from my experience, I'll say it's the nature of the subject.
Thanks, Alan.
You're welcome.
Other questions? Well, if not, we'd like to thank you for joining us. Again, if you have questions, feel free to send them to Alan or myself. We'll gladly try and answer to the best of our ability. And we look forward to having you join us in the future. And feedback is always welcome.
And to that end, if you're on the Facebook page and you have a question, you can even shoot it to us on Facebook and we will respond to the question there. You know, you may even get responses from other people, so you get other people's perspective, not only mine. We're trying to encourage people to use the Facebook page so we can exchange ideas, we can exchange techniques, we can exchange any kind of information, basically.
Thank you so much for the great
Thank you.
presentation.
Well, thank you very much for taking
Awesome.
time to be with us tonight.
Wouldn't have missed it.
Good night.
Nice to see everybody.
Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great night.
Good night.
Night.
Good night.